Okay, hello and welcome to this webinar on people, behavior, and vibrant oceans. My name is Zach Lowe, and I am the Communications Director here at RARE. And we're excited to get started, but before we do, just a few notes. This webinar will focus on the behaviors community-based fishers could adopt to effectively curb overfishing and how RARE's Fish Forever program through Bloomberg Philanthropies' Vibrant Oceans initiative uses behavioral insights to increase the adoption of those behaviors. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers today, and following their remarks, we will have some time for some Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function in your toolbar to submit your question, and we will get to as many as we can. And following the webinar, we will email you a very brief survey to get your feedback on the experience, which will also include some links to more content and information about Fish Forever and the Vibrant Oceans Initiative. So it's a very quick survey, should take less than a minute to fill out, but your feedback is very helpful to us. And with that, I would like to introduce you to our presenters today. And to prove this isn't just a recording, I'm going to actually turn on their cameras so you can see them. First, I want to introduce Melissa Wright. She is the Oceans Lead for Bloomberg Philanthropies. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here.
And I would like to introduce Dr. Steve Box, Senior Vice President of RARE's Fish Forever program. Hi, Steve. Let me actually unmute you so you can actually say hi to people.
Hi, Zach, and hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Looking forward to it.
All right, thank you so much. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Melissa, to begin.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for joining. I know in the middle of a work week and a short week at that, it's hard to squeeze in things like that. So I am happy to be here with Steve Box and my other RARE colleagues to share more information about our partnership. Before I do that, I thought it might be useful for those of you who may not be familiar with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Vibrant Oceans Initiative to give you a little bit of background and context for this work. So Bloomberg Philanthropies is the home of all of Michael Bloomberg's philanthropic endeavors. Michael Bloomberg being the former 12-year mayor of New York City and a leader in business with his company, Bloomberg LP. We are very excited to be partnered with groups like RARE, and next slide, please, with RARE, Oceana, Global Fishing Watch, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and Oceans 5 on what we see as some of the most pressing and urgent environmental issues. We started the Vibrant Oceans Initiative with two key partners, RARE being one, and with Oceana, focused pretty exclusively on sustainable fisheries management about 5.5 years ago now, in 3 key geographies. And we're really testing the concept of could we drive change in sustainable fisheries management and habitat protection by working at the very local level with the communities that RARE is connected to, and alongside national governments, and pushing through national level advocacy and working with Oceana to do that. Over the last several years, we've seen lots of progress and exciting movement in the places where we were partnered, in the Philippines and Brazil, for RARE in particular, and decided just this past 1.5 years or so to expand the reach of the Vibrant Oceans Initiative into not just 3 countries, but 10. We're now partnered with RARE in Brazil, the Philippines, and in Indonesia. The types of issues that the Vibrant Oceans Initiative is intended to drive change around is, again, still sustainable fisheries management at the very local level in small scale fisheries, as artisanal fisheries, at the national level. But we're also putting more of an emphasis on coral reef conservation, given the projection that nearly 90% of coral are projected to die due to the warming that's already baked into our oceans and into our climate system by 2050, we realize that we need to address the nearest term threats. And overfishing, destructive fishing, and pollution are really those things that we can make a difference on now that will give coral reefs and the other ecosystems that fisheries depend upon a chance to survive. So we launched this new phase of our initiative and have been working very closely with RARE. And you'll hear more about this in the webinar coming up with Steve Box's remarks. But putting in even more intentional link to the role of local leaders and the role of the leaders in those communities who are professionalizing the role of fishermen. And I think there's a lot to learn from what RARE has been doing, but what we have tried to incorporate is a lot of the learnings, the lessons that Bloomberg Philanthropies has gained through our work with cities around the globe, through our programs like C40 and the Covenant of Mayors. Some of you may be familiar, and our Mayor's Challenge programs. Michael Bloomberg has been quoted to say that great ideas can transcend city limits and great local leaders can transform the world. So we really believe that this work at the local level, changing people's hearts and minds and behavior locally, has the potential to change the world. And the way back over.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And we'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Steve Box, who is the Senior Vice President of RARE's Fish Forever program. All right, Steve, are you with us?
I am right here, Zach. And thank you, Melissa, for that introduction. You know, it's such a wonderful partnership with the Vibrant Oceans Initiative to work with you, with Bloomberg Philanthropies, and other great partners on such important issues. It takes a village, or as we say here at RARE, it takes communities. So to kick off this afternoon, I wanted to talk briefly about what underpins Fish Forever, what the program is, and then take us on a deeper dive into these behavioral insights that really underpin our approach. So Fish Forever is a global program. It's aiming to improve the lives of millions of the world's poorest people through coastal fisheries reform. We work at the moment in 10 countries, including, as Melissa mentioned, in Brazil and Indonesia and the Philippines. We also work in Mozambique, the Pacific Islands, Myanmar, and in countries along the Mesoamerican Reef. Now, these countries are incredibly important because together they contain nearly a third of the world's coral reefs, over 40% of global mangroves, and their populations are highly dependent on coastal fisheries for food, employment, and as a key part of the productive economy. As the program grows in its second phase, our global staff, and you can see a few of them there, these are our implementing teams that are working, training others around the world, and we're reaching over 250 fishing communities, supporting more than 80 local governments, and currently reaching around 40,000 fishers. That may sound a lot, but to be honest, we're only just getting started as we start to scale the next phase of this program. And our ambitious goal is to engage 500 local governments and be able to reach 1 million fishers worldwide in this quest for coastal fisheries reform. And these million fishers and their families rely on healthy coastal fisheries for their food security, their livelihoods. And the problem we're trying to address is that unmanaged fishing places chronic pressure on this biodiversity of coastal waters, and it damages the short and long-term integrity of that entire ecosystem. So the key question is, how do we mitigate that pressure and balance the equation so that both the people of coastal areas and the nature that supports them can thrive. And that's a very complex challenge, and we'll be digging into how we go about that now. The purpose of this webinar isn't really to dig into the nuts and bolts of all parts of the program, but I wanted to give you a very brief overview of the three core principles. The first is really enabling this community level behavior change towards sustainable fishing. Then, how do we use that to build a community rights-based approach to management that can be used to establish fully protected reserves, so an area-based approach to managing those fisheries, with the reserves protecting habitat and sustaining the local fish populations, both within the reserves and in the surrounding managed access areas where people still fish. And a third tenet of the program is to build government adoption to expand and sustain this management framework by supporting communities and different layers of government to build a co-management framework. But a co-management framework in which fishers and their coastal communities are central to the decision-making process. So we're trying to link rights clearly with responsibility and stewardship. And a key part of achieving that overarching aim is to be able to mobilize communities to achieve that change. And we strongly believe that the right approach to fisheries management is about having local fishers be part of that solution, participating in decision making, having clear rights to access, use, and manage coastal waters. And so we focus on managed access as a tool for equitable regulation of effort that can share the benefits of these effectively placed reserves back to the communities that are investing in their establishment. And what we're seeing is that this is actually a replicable model that has a clear pathway to scale, because we can cluster communities around a common vision, aligning both the individuals and the communities and multiple communities to all look at the same solution set. And we can also align local governments across a coastal zone through common policy goals, and together be able to demonstrate to provincial and national government that a shift in marine management isn't just a possibility, it's actually being implemented by thousands, tens of thousands of their citizens. So we're building a social movement in a way that can network these communities together. And we're also building a political movement that can deliver a management system and be able to sustain it at a scale that can solve this unmanaged overfishing problem. So very briefly, those are Fish Forever's core principles. And although I have a lot more to say about them, today's webinar is really to dig in on this first principle. How do we build a social movement that can deliver both individual and community level behavior change? But to get at that answer, first we have to understand what is community behavior change. RARE is the leading behavior change organization in conservation. And when we talk about behavior change, we mean it's the shift from one behavior to another, enabling people to align positive behaviors that benefit themselves and others. And in fishing, this can really be applied to shift from destructive or competitive fishing into responsible stewardship and the behaviors around that. And I joined RARE as a marine scientist, and with a history of designing marine reserves and working on these issues. I joined RARE because of this unique approach, that we could use it to address complex conservation challenges like overfishing in a way that could shift entire communities and ultimately entire nations in the way they interact with the marine environment. And so fishing is full of individual and collective choices and their connected behaviors. if we want fishers to change the way they engage with the marine environment and interact with each other, we have to consider what underpins those initial choices, the decisions that are being made, and the actions that result from those decisions. And fishing is a behavior. And so this requires absolute fundamental knowledge of both behavioral science and how to apply the relevant behavioral insights to make these changes. Now, this is a vast area of research, and I'm I'm not a behavioral psychologist. I studied behavior, but it was of fish, coral, and algae, and they behave very differently to people. But the simple way to think about this is that behavioral insights, which helps us understand how people make decisions in everyday life, these insights can be grouped. And here we've grouped them into 6 primary categories of strategies that we're calling behavioral levers that you can pull or push to make change. Now, there's 6 on this graph, and you're probably already acquainted with the ones in light blue. So rules and regulation, information, material incentives. These are pretty common ways that are very easy to understand in how they can influence people's decisions. You know, we follow rules, we can set regulations, we can provide information and knowledge, and a material incentive is, you know, providing a benefit or a negative consequence of a specific action. But I want to focus here on the ones you may not be so familiar on, the dark blue ones: emotional appeals, social influences, and choice architecture. Now, the first, people are emotional animals. Our emotions like pride or shame, they really affect our perception of our behavior and the perception of others' behavior. And to be honest, they can really override logic or reason. And I'm sure you all can associate with that. We are emotional people. But we're also social animals. So the behavior, beliefs, and expectations of others are all important about how we think about our own behavior and interactions in the context of our daily lives with those around us, with our family, with our friends, and with society at large. Our social behaviors are very, very important in guiding what is appropriate and what is inappropriate in different situations. And the third one, which has a very wonky name, is choice architecture. The way choices are presented to us, such as whether one option is more visible to us or made the default that you have to change by request. This way of presenting choices can fundamentally change the way we make the ultimate decision and the final choice that we make. But before we dive too deeply into those, I want to briefly share our process for developing behavior change campaigns. Now, when I first got to know Rare, and I imagine this may be a shared understanding on the people on this call, we are known for mascots, for puppet shows, for campaign materials, and to be honest, really good t-shirts. But behind that colorful kit is actually a careful rationale, both in its design, the design of those materials, and its deployment, how we're using them, where we're using them, and when we're using them. Rare uses behavior-centered design, a process that blends the best insights from behavioral science with the user-focused strength of design thinking. And we use that combination to identify the most effective interventions for a specific target audience. In this case, the case of Fish Forever, that audience is fishers and fishing communities, and also with government. And so how we combine and use different materials and approaches to increase the likelihood of the desired change. And I'll explain with some examples in a moment what that looks like. But the first step in this is really to start with collecting profiling data to inform the design of the approach. ecological data, participatory data, household surveys. Fish Forever, to be honest, is a program driven by data. We use it both to inform the design and identify the most appropriate behavioral levers to apply, and then we can use the iteration of that data to measure the efficacy of the delivery. Is it working in the way we would expect? How do we evolve? How do we learn? How do we change? And we can only do that with data. But it's not just about the numbers, it's also the process of collecting this information. This participation is also critical. It helps us build trust within the communities that we're engaging with. And by taking real interest in what's important to the members of these communities, their lives, their beliefs, their vision, their fishery. So this isn't just a string of workshops or sending out people to collect lots of interviews and gather data. This is a careful process to understand motivations and priorities, social structure and context, and to be able to use that to develop and deliver individual and community level changes in key behaviors that can realign people's interaction with the marine environment, with their fisheries. But before I get too deep into this, let me put the brakes on before this gets too wonky. Let's get to some examples to really make this tangible. One of the key things about working in fishing communities, and you may have heard this if you also work with fishers around the world, is the phrases that fishers generally use to describe themselves, especially in poor rural communities. I am just a fisher. I am a poor fisher. I'm a small fisher. Now, if you think about those words, these self-descriptions, you see that they're quite self-deprecating. Small, poor, humble, just. Synonyms perhaps for the perception of self. And actually that self-perception is reinforced by the status quo, by the lack of attention, status, and agency that society has generally given this sector of a community. Now, if we think and believe that we need to build agency in these communities to really be part of the management decision-making process, to deliver what I was saying on these core principles of Fish Forever around co-management and the involvement in fishers in this broader conversation around coastal resource management, then first we have to understand where they're coming from and that starting context, and then what steps would need to happen in that self-perception and in the societal perception of these individuals to make any real change towards that goal. And so on the back of this realization, which happened during the first phase of Fish Forever, we developed a campaign in the Philippines really aimed at recasting that self-perception. A few of those campaign materials you can see here, but this was a very, very broad, integrated approach to shifting this perception of self. The campaign was called Prophy, meaning professional fisher, but Prophy is also a very clever name because it means it's a term of respect in Filipino custom. So just the name of the campaign was also carefully thought about. And we focused on changing that personal narrative, not just by the fisher, but also of the community about the fishers that live across this country. And this shift could then underpin key behavior changes that we identified as really being needed to move towards responsible, sustainable fisheries. So self-perception was really about explaining and driving that message of pride, that fishers are providers of food, they're engines of the rural economy, they're custodians of natural resources, holders of deep knowledge. And so, if you can make that argument, they are also really important to local communities, to the local government, and to the nation as a whole. And our Prophy campaign in the Philippines worked hard to communicate a new message to fishers and those around them, that being a fisher is something to be proud of. You should be proud to say you're a professional fisher, a responsible fisher, and the community around you should be proud of the fishers among them. Local government should be proud to have fishers as members of their constituency. Now, this approach originated out of the Philippines and our program there, but as we were transitioning to the second phase of this program, we saw something so powerful in this approach that we're now expanding this core idea to all of our countries to build pride in coastal fishers across the world. And then this approach aims to align 4 key behaviors to this new identity. So first, it's about shaping the identity and then attaching specific behaviors. So if you are a proud fisher, a professional fisher, then you are a responsible fisher. And to be responsible, here are the key 4 asks that you should adopt to demonstrate that to others. First, you need to be registered. You need to be a registered fisher. You need to exist on paper and be proud of that. You need your catch to be recorded, so it has to be reported, so we know how much is coming out from coastal waters. You need to participate in management, either directly or through a representative, so that your needs and priorities as a responsible fisher are accounted for. And fourth, you need to respect and comply with the no-take zones established as part of your fisheries management strategy for your local fisheries and for the other fishing rules that are being established for the fishing grounds around that area. So 4 things: register, report, participate, respect, and comply. But we can only do that if we can link these responsible behaviors back to that self-perception. And that's how we integrate these 2 things together. And then linking responsible behaviors to the desired outcomes. And that is at the heart of Fish Forever, shaping self-perception, shaping community perception as the building blocks that underpin the shift in behavior that we know we need to achieve in order to deliver the management and reformation of coastal fisheries. Just putting up a poster with some nice rules and regulations, or giving people a few hats or long sleeve t-shirts, those are some of the tools, but without connecting this together, it doesn't make a lot of difference. As these shifts begin to occur, we then need to work out, how do we reinforce and ingrain these behaviors? So I'm going to walk you through a few examples of this. The first one seems to be very, very straightforward, but it's actually critical as a reinforcement mechanism. Public pledges. So pledges made by these newly self-professed professional responsible fishers, and they take a public oath in their community saying, I am responsible, these are the things I'm doing to prove that. And critically, by making that pledge public, the fishers increase the observability of that behavior to their peers, to other fishers. So this drives a belief that others are, or soon will be, fishing differently, that there is a different alternative, and that, look, other people around me are making that change. And that change is coming, and you need to be part of it. The insight is that by making a pledge public, you're more likely to fulfill on that commitment. And I'm sure you can all associate with that. You know, we're pretty good at breaking promises to ourselves, but it's much harder if you've told someone else what you're going to do, what behavior you're going to shift, and they're watching, they're helping you keep your promise. So here's another pretty straightforward example. This time it's coming from Brazil. This is, you know, some fishers, some boats, and some paddles. Very simple. But painting the boats and the paddles with campaign logos, campaign colors that are connected to these overarching campaigns, they serve as a social influence to respect fishing regulations. The boats are a clear symbol to show who is committed to complying with those regulations. And these symbols are observable by other fishers. What they also do is eliminate possible excuses from people in those boats and using those paddles that they didn't know about these fishing rules, about this campaign. What it's doing is removing plausible deniability. You can't say you didn't know. And so just to give you one further example here, this time a different country coming from Mozambique, and this really is one of my favorites, because during our information gathering stage, we found that, as with most other countries, fishers in Mozambique were very unlikely to travel from their communities to district towns, to the fisheries office, simply to get their official artisanal fisher registration. Even though it was a rule, it was a requirement, many countries around the world have that as a piece of fisheries legislation, and very few countries can actually tell you how many fishers there are. It's very difficult to get fishers to register. So the solution that we applied in Mozambique, and we've been applying in many countries around the world, was to bring that system to them. Deploy this beachside as a registration system on the beach in their communities. This not only makes the registration system easier for fishers, they don't have to take days out to go and travel to the district offices, but it made the entire process much more visible. And the salient location about being in the community rather than at a remote government office provides a reminder to register, and a place to see others are also registering. So it's converting registration into a norm rather than the exception. And the other part of this that's also really important is that the process of registration provides fishers with an ID card. Now, that might seem something mundane and fairly normal, but actually we can enable that card to become a symbol, a declaration. I am a fisher, I am a registered fisher, and by being a registered fisher, I am on the path to become a responsible fisher, a professional fisher. And again, we're linking this idea of registration, that activity of registration, back to the overarching campaign messages. And you may see here through these examples, this is an ecosystem of different reinforcing activities and messages that help shift fishers and their communities in the same direction. And so one of the things just to point out here, you may see in the image on the screen, the fisher has a collared shirt on, and we actually added this as a little touch. So you're not in your old fishing t-shirt, or you're putting on a shirt, and your photo that will go on your card is a little bit more professional. You're proud of your appearance. It's these little touches that people may overlook, but they actually help make things stick. That process of, oh, just slip this shirt on over the t-shirt and we'll take the photo with that. That's something people latch onto, that they remember. And we're now thinking about how to take that a step further. How do we craft other moments out of registration? Celebrations when all fishers in the community are registered. What could a celebration look like? A moment of pride. Where all fishers across a municipality are registered. How could the government celebrate that? To be honest, people love moments. Our lives are a series of moments, and some stick out and some don't. And some, we assign significance when you can't really see the logic behind it. Think about things that we put significance on and celebrate. In reality, is there any difference between our 39th birthday and our 40th? You could choose any other combination of numbers there. Well, the answer is no. It's a day just like any other, but we create a moment out of it. We assign significance to it over another. And in a smaller way, we can do the same to some of these processes, like registration, like a whole community all becoming registered and having a moment to help make that stick. And by making it stick, it can stay with them, and the significance of being registered is much more likely to carry on. So behavioral insights do not only apply to individuals. Some of these same behavioral levers can be helpful when encouraging groups, such as networks of local government. It's something that Melissa mentioned in her intro about really doubling down on the power of local government. Now, take a look at this picture. There are 4 mayors sitting at the table. There's a couple of mascots there. There's a professional fisher. on the left. There's one of the fish mascots as well. Those 4 mayors are signing a declaration. Again, it's a public commitment. There's a lot of people in front of them, and they're watching these mayors join to lead change across their coastal waters of 4 neighboring municipalities. And so it's a public commitment for fisheries reform with very key process steps. And now if we go to the next photo, we can see this is catching on. More mayors, this was actually taken about 2 months ago, and they were signing the same pledge for coastal fisheries reform with a same set of principles behind it. And these mayors have shared waters, and by aligning them and getting that commitment, we're showing that they're all moving in the same direction. And what's even more incredible now is seeing that their pledge is inspiring other governments and other local leaders to join that commitment. And in fact, the story of the Filipino mayors actually inspired similar government officials in Honduras. This photo was taken less than a month ago in Honduras. It looks very similar, but those are local mayors on the other side of the world signing the exact same pledge and commitment for coastal fisheries reform, committing themselves, their municipalities, and their communities to this effort. And across Honduras and Guatemala, we now actually have 16 mayors who've made exactly the same commitment. And actually, last week, just to belabor this point a little because I'm so excited by it, I just got back from Mozambique, where local government leaders, again, were signing this up. So now we have 3 continents, and we're seeing a social movement become a political movement, a network of local government peers representing their communities and joining a public pledge, committing to a path forward to solve this global challenge. It's so exciting to see this take shape. And behind that commitment is RARE's commitment to these local governments to work with them and with others to really bring about this substantive change. So I'm going to try and bring this together in a unifying theory. I kind of went through some of the motions of what we do, some of the tools that we use, but here's my attempt to wrap this together for you. And we've identified 4 key beliefs that underpin the transition to what we're trying to establish, a new norm around responsible fishing. First, fishers and their communities need to understand that there is another way to the status quo, that everyone can do better by collectively managing their fishery. You have to set an alternative destination. Now, and the diagram that you can see, imagine blast fishing and moving away from blast fishing. That's a bit of a quaint example, but this can stand for multiple different transformations. But first, you have to say that an alternative is possible. And recognizing this leads to the second key belief. Not that just it's possible, but that people should cooperate so that everyone can be better off. So now I think that I should, and that everyone else should be behaving differently. I should, everyone else should. Step 1, step 2. Now, at this point, it's critical to encourage people to publicly express that they think people should be cooperating, because this leads to the third critical belief. That's the point of these public pledges. That's the point of having conversations and really elevating the narrative. Public expression. Because what we're trying to achieve is that thinking that everyone else in the community believes that everyone should cooperate. So I've gone from I should, I believe everyone else should, and now I believe everyone else in the community believes that everyone should. And that may seem a little similar, but the difference between the second and third step is absolutely critical. It's not just that I know I should behave differently. but all of you know that I know I should behave differently. This understanding is fundamental, and it's fundamental in behavioral science because it transforms what was previously a cooperative dilemma, worrying that if I lose, if I cooperate because you might not be, into a coordination problem, believing that cooperation is beneficial and believing that everyone believes that. And so all we have to do is work out, how do we cooperate? And coordination is much easier to achieve. And we can establish and reinforce that coordination by mechanisms such as regular meetings and discussion groups and community participation in the management bodies, in decision making. So again, there's a connection here between the norm shifts occurring through the behavioral insights and the structures that RARE is helping to build within these communities so that communities can participate and coordinate. And again, these networks are a key part of that. And then the final belief to update is that everyone else is cooperating and behaving differently. That we have achieved this shift. So we've started off by setting up that new destination, knowing that I could, I think we should, I think you think we should, and now I think you will. Once this belief is instilled, people are far more likely to continue to cooperate and sustain that change. Essentially, you've established a new norm, and it's very hard to shift it back. These last two steps, the I think, you think, we should, and then I think we will, is what differentiates an awareness campaign, just making people generally aware that this is important and yes, people probably should do this, with a behavior change campaign. We need to get them through those final two steps. The actions of individuals, informed individuals who believe they should behave differently. If you don't do that, you can't sustain it through time because those individuals that want to do something drown in the sea of non-adopters. So how do we do that? In a very brief wrap, of course, in any group of people, we don't adopt new behaviors at the same time. Many of you may be familiar with this diffusion of innovation theory. We know that the rate at which a new behavior is adopted varies within a group, but it actually varies in a largely predictable way. So if we start on the left of this graph, every group has innovators, the people who are most excited to adopt either a new thing, a new shiny object, or in this case, a new behavior. Early adopters are similar to innovators. They follow the lead of the innovators. The early majority is that first wave. These people will join in once they see change modeled by early adopters. Then there's the late majority as we continue moving across that graph, is the second wave of a community. At this point, a person feels left out if they're not part of that group, and so they'll adopt it. So you've got over the hump. Then there's always the laggards, the people that are last to adopt, and in many cases they just remain skeptical, they want to be contrary, and they're skeptical of that innovation, of that idea, of that behavior, but they can adopt it when forced. So understanding this feature of groups, of group dynamics, and this diffusion of innovation theory helps us actually develop our implementation strategy of how to reach the different audiences with these messages about a new behavior. So, for example, if we have this idea around coastal fisheries reform, can we identify the mayors, the communities, the civil society groups, like fisher associations, that are already excited, that want to be that leading edge, those innovators? How do we connect them then with the early adopters? And how do we elevate and promote that narrative to inspire the early majority? And that's how we build to scale. That's how we take our 40,000 fishers that we have at the moment working on this and reach 1 million. We're going through that innovation and early adopter phase. and then you'll see this rapid acceleration into the early majority. So using behavioral insights and levers is incredibly important when designing activities to shift a norm to a different scale, like governments prioritizing coastal fisheries. Now, I'm sure there are many questions from what I've just talked through, and I'm really looking forward to taking them. The main one I think we might be left with is, does it work? And in the interest of time, I'll go through this very quickly. It was also in the previous webinar I did last year. Our first phase showed that the basic premise of establishing fully protected reserves and enabling communities to really take pride in protecting and managing them works. We saw a 390% increase inside the reserves. We saw more than double the fish biomass outside the reserves in these fishing grounds. And so we know this concept can work, that communities can drive up compliance, can afford effective protection. And what was most striking here was that 98% of these reserves had sustained or increased biomass, which is incredible for area-based management approach, where the global average of MPA effectiveness is about 10%. And critically, just to re-stress, the really important thing here is that the fish biomass was going up in the fishing areas as well. So the shifts that communities were making in terms of responsible fishing was also occurring around those reserves so that there were more fish in the water. And just to recap on the social change, how all of this ties together, this is a very condensed version of all of the data. There's actually 15,000 household surveys that were done to build this data set, and we've condensed it into a 3x3. But if we look at the results on livelihood stability, those upward green arrows across Brazil, Indonesia, and the Philippines, that was statistically significant. People believed that their lives were more secure than they were previously. They have a better outlook going forwards. And we saw that across the board. In the Philippines, where our program was largest and had been working the longest, you can see that those green arrows are up in overall well-being and in food security. The communities believe they are doing better. But what this data doesn't show, that I just want to highlight, is that the community process, we found that the journey was just as important as the destination, that the process of participation, of inclusion, drives both individual and the community behavior change. There's a lot of data. We published the report last year. It's available online. We're also converting that into a peer-reviewed publication that is churning its way through review at the moment. And we will be sending a copy of the final report out to those that are interested. Now, I started this webinar with a declaration that it takes a community to make this work. And the broader community that Fish Forever is a part of includes elevating this topic globally and ensuring it becomes and remains a priority with government, with philanthropy, and with aid agencies. And with the existing support of Bloomberg Philanthropies and the many other foundations and agencies that we're working with and proud to partner with around the world, we are demonstrating that a solution is possible, that change is possible. And as this movement builds, there is a growing interest that leveraging insights from behavioral science can address this issue and actually other complex conservation problems as well. And to end, my sincere belief here is that if we can solve this challenge around coastal fisheries, which is a really complex social, ecological, and political challenge, the same approach could be applied to other global challenges. Because this is about social change. This is about building a social movement. And that change, that interaction with the natural world, starts with our behavior. So with that, thank you so much for listening to me monologue. and I'm very excited to take any questions.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks everyone for sending in. We do have several questions, and so we'll get to as many as we can over the next few minutes. So I want to begin with one, and Steve and Melissa, feel free to weigh in. Can you use the same behavior change template for working with local fishermen and apply it to industrial scale fishing? This participant assumes that the worst overfishing is actually being done by large commercial fishing operations around the world.
First, so I'll take the first stab at this, and then Melissa, if you want to add in. To take the question backwards, I think there is an assumption that the worst overfishing is done by industrial fisheries, but I think the data is starting to prove otherwise, that actually chronic coastal fisheries by small-scale fishing communities is actually responsible for far more of the global catch than we ever previously realized. We actually just published a paper from Honduras based on catch reconstruction that showed that for the past 15 years, the catch by the small-scale fleet had exceeded that of the industrial fleet, both in volume and value, but no one had realized because the data was so poor. So that's just a kind of an aside, just to push back on the assumption. In terms of the approach, I think in principle, there are elements of this that can be applied to industrial commercial fisheries. Again, the people driving those boats are making decisions about where they fish, how they fish, when they fish. Those are decisions that are made by individuals and by groups of individuals, by vessel owners. So yes, I don't necessarily think exactly the same tools that we use in coastal community-based fisheries and to drive towards community-based management make sense, but certainly the general premise that understanding why fishers are making certain decisions in a certain context and then working out how can you shape and influence those decisions, I certainly believe that is highly applicable to industrial fisheries. And in fact, to give a Honduran example, again, we are now engaging in the margins actually of the program with the industrial fisheries sector, who are seeing this transformation of the small scale fisheries and saying, how do we come together and ensure the sustainability of our industrial fisheries? So yes, I do see there being an opportunity there.
Great. Another question. Melissa, do you want to go?
Yeah,
go ahead,
actually, just a couple of things here. One of the other major efforts that the Vibrant Oceans Initiative is working on is transparency in the fishing sector. And back to Steve's slides on how do behavioral insights make a difference, the presumption behind that question is sort of like, you know what the behaviors are. And industrial fleets are often out of sight and behaving in ways that you can't always detect without having more transparency. So we've been partnering with a group some of you may be aware of called Global Fishing Watch. There are others, but this one is an open source platform where you the AIS system from boats are then captured by the signals are captured by satellites. It's displayed on a platform in near real time. And we are partnering with Global Fishing Watch and groups like Oceana and others, and governments around the world to put even more data onto those platforms, so that the types of behavioral influence, the social influence of transparency, just knowing that you're being watched and that people can see what your fishing behavior is, that in itself is somewhat transformative, and we're looking to take it even further with rules and regulations and other kind of material incentives for good behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, what work has RARE done on gender equity in fishing communities around the world? This is a timely question as next week's UN World Oceans Day is themed Gender and Oceans. World Oceans Day is June 8th. Steve?
That is again a great question. During the first phase of the work, we did truly start to identify and quantify the important role that women play in fisheries. It has been over the past several years a growing area where people are realizing how important gender equity in fisheries is. I don't have a great deal of time to go into it, but what we have been doing is starting to partner with gender experts around the world, including KIT, which is a Dutch research institute, which are experts in mainstreaming gender into our projects and into our project approach. We're actually building new approaches for both some of the participation work, for ensuring that all of the work is inclusive and representative, not just of women and men, but also of other marginalized groups, to make sure that the management groups that we're setting up are transparent, are equitable, and are inclusive of all members of society. So it's a huge part of the work, gender mainstreaming for Fish Forever as a whole, and I'd be very excited to tell people more about that at a later date, or offline if someone would like to inquire further.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more, depending on, I guess, the length of answers, Stephen and Melissa. But here's a relatively quick one. Is the social fisheries reform that the mayors are committing to, that you discussed, a publicly available resource?
I'm not entirely sure I know the core of the question there. If I could repeat it back. Is the pledge something that is publicly available? Yes, that document people can look at and see what the principles are. We will actually be curating that movement building to start sharing more information about that network and the activities of those mayors and leaders and their constituent communities around the world. That is part of our work with the Vibrant Oceans Initiative. The 6 principles that the pledge has, yes, publicly available, people can see. I'm not sure if that was the intent of the question.
That's how I read it, and I would even add to that, we have an article up recapping the recent event in Honduras, which includes some of what the mayors were committing to, so we can be sure to share that with the participants today. Let's finish with one more. Often in the places that we're working, fisheries are way overfished, and yields will have gone down with the implementation of managed access and no-take zones. How have we addressed this down period while stocks recover? Because this might take years depending on the species.
It's a great question. It's one I do get asked. I imagine many people get asked all the time. In fact, I was asked it on the last webinar. My first response is that a lot of the rebound that we're seeing actually in the communities that are implementing this is coming from essentially pushing out illegal fishing from these areas, including incursions of illegal commercial vessels fishing in coastal waters. And by pushing that out and essentially being able to reallocate that catch into the coastal fisheries, into these coastal community-based fishing operations, that can cushion the adoption curve of implementing fully protected reserves and the managed access areas. So it was a huge concern of how to get communities through this J curve when the first phase of Fish Forever was implemented, and we were really looking at that. And what we were finding, both in terms of evidence in the water and the narratives coming from the communities, was that the drop in productivity from those communities was not significant enough to stop them from wanting to implement. So there may have been some small cost, but both the time and the duration of that dip, they managed to span it without additional external support. And in terms of fisheries rebound, a lot of the species that we've been focusing on with these communities are the smaller, faster growing species, so that the life cycle is so much shorter that they will rebound a lot faster. And to give you a quick anecdote, one of the communities we were working with in Southeast Sulawesi, for example, an incredible customary community called Leah, they were focusing on a rabbit fish as their fishery of importance. And they started seeing rebounds in that within 2 years, and with huge positive responses about the increase in the productivity by putting in these fully protected reserves and by establishing managed access within a networked by these communities. So it is a concern. It's something we continue to look at, but I think reallocation and getting rid of illegal fishing from coastal waters can provide that cushion.
Okay, we're going to finish up with one question. This will go to each of you. Before we do, just a reminder to all of our participants that we will be sending an email with a very, very quick survey. We'd love it if you could fill that out and send that back to us. It should take you less than a minute. And there's some interesting resources in there that expand upon both what Melissa and Steve talked about today. So give those a read, give those a listen. And then we had several other questions that we weren't able to get to, so we will work on getting answers to those and following up with everyone as well. So thank you for attending. But let me finish with this question to both of you, and I'll start with you, Steve, and then give Melissa the last word. But what are you most proud of about the Vibrant Oceans Initiative thus far?
That's again a great question. I'm proud of many things. So being able to hone in on one may be difficult. I'm very proud that Vibrant Oceans focused on an issue that many people weren't looking at and really started to shine a spotlight on this problem. And the more we learn, the more important it really seems. And so I'm very proud for that initial focus to say this is actually an environmental challenge that is becoming a humanitarian crisis, and we need to confront it. And I think it's incredible the momentum that is now being built around that. And so the second thing that I'd be proud of is actually the hundreds of people and tens of thousands of fishers that are really committing to this reform. We know it's not easy. We know there's adoption costs. We know that the status quo and short-term kind of exploitation wins out if you're only thinking in the short term. And to see communities make personal and community-based commitments over the long term, hear these narratives, hear the way people are proud that they're able to confront such a complex problem, that is just incredible to see. And I'm super inspired to hear those stories. And really my job at Rare is to be able to tell them to others and really keep building that movement. So that I'm super proud, both that people took the initial jump, both in terms of Vibrant Oceans and then in terms of these communities, and that we're seeing change and that there is hope that the future does not have to be the same as today. It can be better.
Thanks. And Melissa, let's give you the last word.
Thank you. I too am proud of many things with the Vibrant Oceans Initiative, but one of the things that I find really unique and interesting, the longer I spend focused on these issues, is oftentimes when you talk about conservation or environmental problems, when you talk about people, you're talking about the problem. you're talking about how just human-induced degradation is driving all, and that's, you know, that's not false. We are. But what I love about the RARE approach and working with this team is to turn that, it's really about turning it on its head and finding the opportunity in people's sort of natural instincts and desires to be, you know, positive influences in their community and do the right thing for themselves and their children. You know, the reason why Mike Bloomberg got involved in environmental work at all was really around his mission to ensure better, longer lives for the greatest number of people. And there are just, you know, millions and millions, billions of people that are reliant on fish for food, and thinking about ways that we can drive behavior change and use people's sort of their best instincts and motivations to help turn this problem around. So that's what I really love about working with RARE and what I feel proud of around this work.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you everyone for attending. Reminder that email with the survey will be in your inboxes shortly. We will have a recording of this webinar available that we will send to you, and some follow-up material as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Melissa, for participating. Thank you, Dr. Steve Box, for taking us through these 4 behaviors. And please visit more information about the Vibrant Oceans Initiative at Bloomberg.org. You can see the address on your screen. And for more information on Fish Forever, visit rare.org at that URL as well. Thank you, everyone, so much, and we will see you next time.